Hi there, my name is Bob Judson and you're listening to Leading for Life Stories. I'm delighted you're here and I'm really glad to have you on my podcast, and I very, very much hope you enjoy it. Welcome back, everybody. When I last did one of these personal stories podcasts, I was just completing a short 18-month but very eventful tour at Royal Air Force Brüggen in Germany. And I'd loved it. I'd been in the nuclear role, the strike role, and the attack role there, and on number 17 Squadron first, and then completed my tour with number 14 Squadron. And the reason I changed squadrons was because that was the point we were changing the whole base over to Tornado. We were shifting from 4 Jaguar squadrons to ultimately 4 Tornado squadrons by the time I left. So it was exciting to be part of that change, but also slightly sad that we were folding up very successful, long-standing Jaguar squadrons and transitioning to a new aeroplane, new era, and new capabilities in many instances with what the Tornado brought as well. But it was time to move. I'd sort of expected that I was going to go to the Tornado myself at some point along that journey, because pretty much everyone else had been saying that to me as well, that was what was likely to happen. And in reality, it didn't. I ended up going up to Royal Air Force Laarbruch and spent the next 3 and a bit years actually on 2 Squadron at Royal Air Force Laarbruch. That was another big Germany base. We had 3 other squadrons there at the time. 20 Squadron had actually moved from Brüggen as the first Tornado Squadron or first Jaguar Squadron to fold at Brüggen, and had formed as a Tornado Squadron at Laarbruch to create space at Brüggen for the rest of the transition to actually start taking place down there. And 2 other squadrons that were there, 15 Squadron and 16 Squadron, both Buccaneer squadrons in the attack role. So very venerated aeroplane, used a lot again previously in the nuclear role itself, but also then in the attack role. And so we had a kind of completely different complement of aeroplanes to the way it had been at Brüggen. And 2 Squadron was also very different because it was a reconnaissance squadron. It was we had a 100% reconnaissance role. We did have an attack capability. But essentially that made it photography on steroids. We were flying with a reconnaissance pod on the center of the airplane, center line underneath the airplane, that was really capable. It had a swathe of cameras, 5 cameras in it. It had a nose-facing camera and 4 cameras in a fan that looked horizon to horizon. So essentially you could go just above, about 5 degrees above the horizon if you're flying straight and level, all the way around to filming 5 degrees above the horizon on the other side. So you'd get a full swathe if you ran all the cameras simultaneously, which we mostly did, of everything that was under the aeroplane. And we also had an infrared line scan, if you like, a heat camera that ran as well. So the pod itself would provide you a lot of capability, a lot of imagery. And we also had an upgraded Jaguar. The Jaguar I'd flown at Brüggen had been very much the sort of first generation operational aeroplane. But when we got to Laarbruch, we were equipped with what was then called the Ferranti Inertial Navigation 1064, FIN 1064. And that changed a whole load of things. It changed the navigation system in the airplane very much for the better, made it a lot more accurate than it had been previously. It also changed a lot of the ergonomics in the cockpit. It provided more ability to keep your head out of the cockpit, looking head up, because we had instrumentation and so on that was improving, and the layout of the various bits of equipment in the cockpit was improved as well. So it was a much nicer airplane to fly in many ways, because it gave you what you needed in a way that the previous airplane just hadn't been quite as good at. I was also an experienced pilot. I was a second tourist. I'd been obviously done my first tour, albeit a short one, at Brüggen, and was now considered very much to be on that sort of experienced pilot journey. And during the tour, I was, I got 1,000 hours on the Jaguar. 1,000 hours on a fast jet is always a sort of big milestone that you change badge by and large. You have a badge that says you've got 1,000 hours on the airplane. And it's quite a big thing. And so it was busy. We were flying a lot. We did a lot of tremendously fun flying. And I'll talk more about that in just a second as well. And with another great bunch of people and great camaraderie, and still very much in that kind of Cold War mode. It was obviously coming towards an end. I arrived in November 85. I left in 1989 when we actually folded up the squadron. And I transitioned across to an exchange tour, actually. And again, I'll talk much more about that on a separate podcast, because that was a really interesting time to work on an exchange with another Air Force. But the reconnaissance role itself, I think, is worth some time because it was a really interesting thing to do. And it also was something that I cut my teeth, if you like, on 2 Squadron, but I then moved through my Jaguar time more and more in reconnaissance, because even the attack squadrons at Coltishall, where I subsequently ended up later on, we did a lot of reconnaissance by then, because when we were on operations, we were flying operationally, doing reconnaissance work a lot of the time, as well as attack work. And so we got very good at it, and we spent an awful lot of time perfecting what we did, both in terms of the capability of the aeroplane itself and also the piloting skills to make sure that you put the aeroplane in the right place to take the best pictures, but also your own ability to turn around and recognize and look at what was there on the ground. Because certainly in the low-level reconnaissance role, that was a key element of what we did. So typically, what did a sortie look like? Would go and fly about an hour 20, probably, on a typical Germany sortie. And in that time, we would fly 5 different targets. And usually that would mean you had 3 pinpoint targets that you planned before you took off. A line search, which would be a strip between 2 roads where you'd actually you'd either fly a strip search, which would be a straight line, which was rare but easy to do, or much more challenging. And what we did on most sorties was would fly covering a road. And the idea would be you'd start at point A and you'd finish at point B. And that would probably be better part of a minute maybe of flying, with the plan to try and make sure that the cameras always covered the road. Now, if you're driving on a road, that's quite easy, because obviously, you're going at a speed where you can easily turn around the corners, even if they're sharp corners, and you can stay on the road, hopefully most of the time. In an aeroplane, covering a road like that is a lot more challenging, because obviously the aeroplane's turning circle is much bigger than a car. You're flying much faster. We were doing these typically always at 450 knots minimum, maybe sometimes 480 knots. So you're flying in excess of 500 miles an hour, and you're trying to make sure you stay effectively following the road accurately. And so you had to anticipate the turns. You had to make sure you were turning early enough to keep the cameras imaging the road, even if you couldn't see it at that point, and flying very accurately, navigating down the map, physically flying it by eyeball, basically on a 50,000 ordnance survey scale, ordnance survey type map, to ensure that you got that camera coverage. And all the while, what we'd also be doing on these is looking for stuff that was on them, and that was relatively straightforward in some ways on the first few targets you planned, because you'd plan those on the ground. You'd have an idea what was going to be there. You knew whether it was going to be a bridge or an airfield or a power station or a barracks or a missile site. So you'd kind of know in advance. The 5th target would fly on most of those sorties would almost invariably be an in-flight target. So you would actually pick the map up and take the map with you. But that was all you'd have. You didn't know where the target was on that map. So you'd have the entirety of of effectively an ordnance survey style map. And you'd get the coordinates for the target, either when you taxied out or airborne. And you'd plot them airborne. You wouldn't actually plot them on the ground, even if you received them on the ground. So that was a more challenging situation, because you didn't do any planning. You had to just turn around and make sure you obviously would rely on the nav kit to a certain extent to get you into the general area, but also then you had to physically go and find that target and look at what was there and be able to try and identify it. And the reason we did that was in case the cameras failed. So you actually had a decent idea from a pilot report, a visual report of what was actually there, and would put some of those back as in-flight reports. So if it was a really important target, would actually would radio that back via either HF radio or UHF radio back, so we could actually report what was there immediately in real time. Or when we got back, certainly in the training process, what we'd actually do is, before you actually looked at the film and looked at what you'd actually covered on those targets, you'd actually go and write what you'd seen. So if it was a missile site, for example, you'd go and list exactly what you had seen there in terms of the radars you'd seen, the missiles you'd seen, the layout of the site, the amount of transporter erector launchers you'd seen, all those sorts of things. And it's quite a detailed process that was designed to teach you to look for the important things that were there, look for what was missing, and essentially to assess the operational capability of any given target. So, and that would include things like, as I say, infrastructure targets, bridges and power stations and so on. So you had a very good idea of whether it was a functioning target by the time you actually got to it, and you particularly when we did. And we trained to do this. Obviously, we didn't do it for real. Was to do post damage assessment. So we actually would go back and do pre-attack reconnaissance quite a lot of the time to actually look at what was there, so we could actually target, provide information for the bombing run, if you like, to go in and accurately target the right places. But also would do post-attack reconnaissance, where we'd actually go in and do battle damage assessment of what had actually happened, how effective had the attack been, and see whether or not we could provide any further insight that would inform further targeting if it was required, et cetera, or assumptions around what capability remained there. And so typically you'd go and fly that sortie, you'd do your hour 20, you'd come back with 5 targets worth of film. All of those were timed, just like they had been for the attack targets we used to do when I was at Brüggen. And so it was a very accurate process. You were really focused on precision, attention to detail, accuracy in every sense. And you'd come back, you'd go to the Reconnaissance Intelligence Center pretty soon after you'd got changed, grabbed a cup of coffee, and you'd go in and you'd write your visual reports, and then you'd sit there with the photo interpreters who were going through your film with a fine-tooth comb, looking at what you'd actually found. And some of the time you'd obviously find things you weren't expecting to find, because there'd be kit that was just in the field that you hadn't expected to see. Equally, hopefully you'd cover the targets, and you'd have a good look at comparing your analysis of the target with what was actually there when you looked at the photographs. The photographs clearly don't lie. And it was fascinating to see the level of attention to detail we could get into with that, and really start drilling into, I suppose, proper capability for what we were trying to do with that role. And we were seriously good at it. And just like when we've been at Brüggen, we did lots of exercises to train for war, if you like, and working right up to and including the NATO tactical evaluation process, where you'd come and be externally assessed, and people would come and look at your capability. And I think we were very proud at the time that we had tremendous operational capability with the aeroplane, and and it was also fun. It was really rewarding. We'd spend hours. I know this sounds pretty sad when you listen to it in hindsight, but we'd spend hours looking at slides of kit. And so pictures of particularly now Warsaw Pact kit, but also our kit, friendly kit, and not just UK, obviously all of the NATO nations, and identifying it. And we would get very precise about exactly what we had seen on those slides. It was very competitive amongst all of us to turn around and be able to recognize, even from small partial pictures of particular pieces of equipment, to turn around and be able to tell you it was that particular type of tank, or it was that particular type of armored personnel carrier, or that particular missile, or this was the type of bridge it was, or this was the type of communications mast it was, and roughly what its capabilities were. And so you can imagine the level of preparation and time it took to actually get you to a point where you really had all that knowledge piled into your head. And we overdid it. There's no doubt we overdid it. We overtrained, because we deliberately overtrained in order to make sure that when we were actually flying those missions, you'd probably be able to do 60% of what you'd actually been doing on the ground. So your identification of kit was very good. You got seriously good at being able to do it. And again, that became quite competitive. And we'll do competitions. We had some hilarious things where we'd actually go and say, right, we're going to do a speed plan competition. So we'd all fly the same targets. We'd obviously prearrange, usually with the British Army or indeed Allied armies. They would put kit out for us to go and film, and for us to basically have a challenge about who got closest, who did the best, and in terms of getting the best images of it, finding things that were difficult to find particularly on things like line searches. And all of that was immensely challenging on a personal level, and also on a squadron level, to make you as good as you can be at it. And that competitive element, I really think, is a translatable thing into the external world. We're feeling that you induce fun competition to actually make it a challenge to be the best you can be, because that's what this is ultimately all about, trying to make sure that individually and collectively you are really feeling that you're at the top of your game. So professionally, it was a hugely rewarding time, no doubt about that. There was lots and lots going on, never a shortage of things to do. We were flying a lot. would typically fly somewhere between 250 and 300 hours a year, which compared to where things are now, that is a huge amount of flying. And you felt the days were busy. But the social life was great as well. Just as at Brüggen, a very, very social environment. You were a little bit of a captive audience because obviously a lot of us lived on the station in married quarters or off the station in sort of patches, married patches as we called them. So estates, if you like, of houses that were specifically for our people. And we did an awful lot of socializing. It was very much a work hard, play hard environment. I'd got to the point by that stage that I was allowed to live out of the officers' mess. So at Brüggen, I'd been a young pilot, had to live in the mess initially, and then I shared a flat. I went out and shared a flat, rented flat with a very good friend of mine, friend to this day, in one of the local villages, and that was great. It was fantastic to have sort of a slightly different life away from from just being in the mess and being in part of the local community. And the other thing that happened was that I mentioned previously in these personal stories that 9 of us had finished flying training, and having started with 18 at basic flying training, 9 of us had got through, and all 9 of us made it to the Fastjet front line in basically across the entire spread of aeroplanes that the Air Force operated at that stage. And we had, over the course of a few years, 8 weddings and a funeral. So to paraphrase slightly, the film of 4 Weddings and a Funeral, which many of you I'm sure will have seen, and obviously it was tragic. We lost one of the guys that we trained with, Martin Ramsey, very good friend of mine, who was very, very sadly killed in an accident in a Lightning, actually a couple of years prior to this. And luckily, to this day, touching wood heavily as I say this to you, he was the only one that was actually killed in a flying accident, which was, I think we were lucky in that sense at a time when lots of people were definitely falling by the wayside. But the other 8 weddings were all very entertaining. And of course, we all went to all the weddings. So we all invited each other, and we had a great camaraderie at all of these. And mine was one of them. So that was a change as well. That suddenly I was now married as well as being on the RAF front line. And at that stage, there was a big joke going around that 90% of male RAF officers were married to either nurses, teachers, or female RAF officers, Women's Royal Air Force as they were known at the time. And that you can see why that happened, because certainly in the Germany environment, those were the ladies you came into contact with. And it was still a very, very male-dominated Air Force in those days, much better now in terms of equality. But it was kind of inevitable that you rubbed shoulders with and met up with and ended up dating and going out with women who were in those roles. And so I became one of the 90% because my ex-wife was an air traffic controller, and she was at Laarbruch at the time, and so that was quite entertaining. That you had a kind of work relationship as well as obviously a married relationship. But it did mean that the whole thing melded together. Really, the difference between work and life was negligible in many ways. It was a vocational world that we were living in anyway, and remained that way right through my career. To be honest, it's not a job. It is definitely something you do as a vocation, and it's definitely something where the work element is largely difficult to separate from the life element. That's not to say you don't have a life outside the Air Force, and particularly these days, I think many people do much better at doing that. But then in the Germany environment, we didn't really have that much separation between the two. And I think largely because we were so busy, there was so much going on, the flying was demanding, we spent quite a lot of time deploying to other places and doing other things, and would have some tremendous fun on some of those exercises as well, where we'd go away from home base to operate somewhere else to do the same thing but in a different airfield. And some of those were big NATO exercises. So I remember while I was at Laarbruch on that tour, going off for the first time to an exercise called Maple Flag, which is held in Canada in a place called Cold Lake, Canadian Air Force Base Cold Lake. And that is appropriately named. It's a long way north of Edmonton in Alberta, in the middle of nowhere really. But the flying there was extraordinary, because we'd operate in those kind of environments. We would work down from our normal 250-foot minimum down to 100-foot minimum. And 100 feet, 30 yards effectively, is incredibly low as a flying height. And to operate and do reconnaissance at that height was just amazing fun because, of course, you get much bigger pictures of things. You're seeing them much more close up, but making sure you're positioning right so you get the camera would image things well and you'd get good pictures of what you wanted to have and you didn't split them across frames was a real skill. And would work hard to ensure that we did that really, really well. And at the same time, having a great time, seeing other bits of the world, doing the stuff that I think most people's perception of the armed forces is what it's all about. You know, you're joining to go and see the world and do a really kind of exciting, challenging job. And it certainly was that in those days. It was absolutely outstanding. What else was important at that point? I think when I got to the end of that tour, so 1989, we could see the end coming for 2 Squadron. We knew we were going to be handing over to a Tornado Squadron. And where the Tornado Squadrons that had taken over from us on the attack side of life had been very capable. The Tornado at that point was already a very capable aeroplane with at least at the very start of its life, at least as much capability as the Jaguar, and in most instances, much more. It went further, it carried more, had it was a 2-seat aeroplane. It had a much better navigation system. It could fly at low level in cloud at night because it had terrain following radar, those sorts of things. So it was an enormously capable aeroplane. But with the reconnaissance capability, it was different. And I remember very clearly feeling a real sense of frustration that we were handing over in 1989 to 2 Squadron Tornado, who their reconnaissance kit, described ours in terms of the pod that we had and so on, their reconnaissance kit was 2 handheld Nikon cameras that the squadron had that they'll basically take flying because that was what they had. Because the system that had been put into the airplane didn't work properly at that point. Now, I don't want to give the wrong impression here because it definitely improved. It got much better and they developed an enormously good capability over time. So, like a lot of things that the UK military has done over the years, often we're bringing something in at a slightly lower level of capability and then getting it to the point we want it to be as time progresses. But it was deeply frustrating to be the best of the best, and we really did feel we were the best of the best, to be a bit cliched with Top Gun, that we knew we were absolutely the top of the game doing this stuff on reconnaissance. And then we're handing over to a squadron who the people were great and the airplane in principle was great, but actually they just didn't have the equipment to do the job at the point they started up. And that was really tough. It was very frustrating. And the other side of it was just watching what was happening geopolitically, because things were starting to shift. And I'll talk more about this in another episode, because I mentioned earlier I went from this job to an exchange tour. Partway through my tour on 2 Squadron, I was presented with a very difficult choice, one of those really interesting forks in the road. The logical next step for me would have been to go and be a qualified weapons instructor if I was going to stay on the Jaguar, to actually go and do the qualified weapons instructor course and then go to one of the Coltshall-based squadrons in Norfolk and be the weapons instructor, which every squadron has at least one of those, on another frontline squadron. And I was the candidate for this to go. I knew I was the number one name in the frame. And then I was offered a job to go and actually work for the German Air Force and fly the Phantom, totally different airplane. The Air Force, Royal Air Force, obviously operated Phantoms at that point in the air defense role, but this was to operate Phantoms in the reconnaissance role at a place called German Air Force Bremgarten, which was right down in the southwest of Germany in Baden-Württemberg. Beautiful area, and lots and lots of attraction around that. And I had a clear choice to make. It was very binary. It was, you can't do the QY course and go to an exchange. You have to decide whether you want to do the weapons instructor course or go on exchange. And I made the choice to go on exchange. And it's one of those things where I'm a very no regrets person. I believe that if you've taken a choice, you go down that fork in the road, then that's a choice you can't walk back from. And I don't regret it in many ways, but there are some things that definitely were difficult downstream, because I moved to the German Air Force having done a 6-month language course through 1989. I arrived in September 89 at German Air Force Bremgarten, and in November 89 the Berlin Wall came down. And so the Cold War ended effectively, and all the transitions started to happen then in terms of German unification and so on. And I'll talk a lot more about that on another podcast, because I think there's more to say on this. But then, of course, in 1990, the Gulf War happened. And so all of my friends who were still on the Jaguar force, who are now at Coltishall, were heavily involved in what they were doing for the Gulf War. And a contingent, obviously, of the Jaguar force went to be very much part of the Gulf and actively flew very successfully in that operational campaign to liberate Kuwait. And that's a tough thing. If you spent your whole career to date building up operational capability and readiness, then missing out on the day that they actually go and do it is quite tough. And of course, the German Air Force, very different. They didn't get involved in Gulf War I at all. They stayed fairly clear of it politically. They had lots of constitutional challenges they were wrestling with at that stage as well, around what they were going to do actively as a military outside NATO environments. And so I was sat on a squadron in the German Air Force, watching my friends go off to a war that I thought, really, had I made a different choice and gone down that different fork in the road, then I would have been there. Definitely, I would have been there. I would have been one of the weapons instructors, that would have been part of it. And that was something I've always kind of looked at. If there's ever something I've thought, did I make the right choice? That's probably the one point that I would anchor on and say, no, I'm not quite sure that I did. Although, of course, it developed different things and brought different skills to bear, not least on further building on the reconnaissance capability I developed at RAF Laarbruch. So it was an interesting time. It was a frustrating time in some ways at the very end for those reasons that I've mentioned. But it then opened other doors and set up new chapters and offered an opportunity to go and fly in a brand new airplane. As I say, brand new to me, not brand new in terms of the airplane. The airplanes themselves were definitely pretty old at that point, but it was a very capable airplane, very powerful, completely different to the Jaguar in that sense. And in a lovely part of the world, and it gave me an opportunity to learn the German language, which was also a fascinating thing to do. So I can't complain too much, but it was definitely different. I don't think there's many lessons that I'm throwing at you and things that are top tips here, other than the one I'll come back to that I mentioned earlier on, is around this business of competition and equally precision, attention to detail, accuracy, and how much difference it actually made. We overtrained. There's no question we overtrained in the role on 2 Squadron, but it made us very good in the environment that we were actually aiming to be very good in. And so putting in that extra constant effort, I think, was worth it. And it definitely was good to have the competitive side as well, to be in a position where you're peer-to-peer competitive, that you wanted to be up at the front end of the hunt for that. And I know that's kind of not necessarily something that's desired today in many walks of life, but I personally think it made me much better at what I do. It gave me an edge that I've never really lost in terms of interest about the things that I do. And so I'd encourage you to think about, how can you do that? How can you put more detail in? How can you be more competitive in what you do? How can you introduce fun competition into the things you do? Because if you do that, you make life rewarding, you make it interesting, you make it challenging. And that's what people love to do. They like to feel like that, in my experience. They like to feel that it's worth getting out of bed for, to go and do this. So I hope that's useful. As ever, I'm really appreciative of the feedback that I get when I talk to people about these podcasts, and I hope you've enjoyed this one. More to come, more great guests lined up in the relatively near future as well. But if you haven't done it already, please subscribe. Please give me a review if you can. Please, most importantly, share with your friends. Tell them about it so that people start listening that aren't already listening. That would be great from my point of view. But I'm very, very grateful for you being there again for me. And I'll speak to you again soon. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Thank you.